I again welcome you. I am really excited about it, and I would like to introduce Dr. Noah Hahn. I was going to say there is a common theme, and it's not really breast cancer, believe it or not, but between the bunch of us who are speaking today and others, it is GU and it's prostate, which is amazing. So I want to introduce Dr. Noah Hahn, who is actually a GU oncology clinical research expert. He's an associate professor of medicine at IU, and he has agreed to be the executive officer for the Big Ten Consortium. Noah?
Thanks, Maha. As Maha mentioned, I've had the honor and the privilege to serve as the executive officer of this new Big Ten Consortium for about a year now, and I have to say it's been one of the most exciting and rewarding years of my life from a cancer standpoint. I think like a lot of people in this room, people don't wind up in oncology by chance. They choose to go into it, and I think for a lot of us, we choose to go into it because we feel that it matters. It matters some way to us in some way, whether it's a personal story, whether it's the science, whether it's the bedside manner. We do a lot of things day to day to try to achieve that mission, but the Big Ten Consortium for me in the last year has been something that has hit at home because it feels like it matters to me, and I think it matters to everyone in this room, the steering committee, and the institutions that are committed to it. And I'm going to touch on a little bit here about the fine points of how it's a little different, what we've done in this past year, to give you a little bit of heads up of just what we've been working on, where we are today, and where we want to go. This is not going to be an in-depth, long discussion. I'm going to spend about 15 minutes. I just want to give you the highlights, and as Maha had mentioned, afterwards there's still going to be plenty of time to socialize and have more drinks and ask questions and so forth. The folks with the flowers on are steering committee members or other folks in association with the Big Ten Consortium. And before I launch into this, I want to put a couple of thanks out before we get to the end here. First, I want to thank Eric Dudek for actually securing a facility for us to have it at this fine venue. That was a huge issue for us that he came through on us. As you can imagine, trying to find a venue ASCO week for this type of thing is not always the easiest thing, so I want to give him thanks. I want to thank the staff at the Hoosier Oncology Group for planning this event and for everything they've done on the infrastructure side, for the steering committee calls, the face-to-face meetings, and things that have happened this year. It's been a tremendous amount of effort that has been rewarding, and it's been effort that is never in the day-to-day plan, and they've found a way to get it done. And I want to thank my colleagues in the steering committee for all their work putting this together. It's been incredibly rewarding to see the commitment. So with that in mind, I want to just go through a couple things about the consortium and why we're here. So many of you know we're in this business of drug development in cancer, and this is a look back about 2 to 3 years ago of just how many drugs are in development in different diseases. We were close to 1,000 drugs back in 2010, and I'm sure we're far over that by now. This is some of the most recent statistics. That's incredibly encouraging because there's a lot of targets and there's a lot of things I think that we are excited about that we hope translate into changes and improvements for our patients. But that's incredibly challenging. How do we as investigators, as sponsors, as granting agencies, as patient advocacy groups, how do we prioritize how to develop these drugs, in what order, what sequence, and how do we make that a more efficient process? This next slide I think we're all too familiar with in this crowd. The typical lifeline for a drug that makes it to FDA approval is typically 15 years plus. We start with often 10,000 candidate compounds to eventually get to one drug that is FDA approved. That's a tremendous amount of effort looking at things that unfortunately do not get to our ultimate end goal, which is improving our patients' lives. If we look at this a little bit differently, there's very real cost associated with this. This is looking at, on average, the amount of R&D resources spent by various sponsors to get one drug approved. And this is as of about 2011. So you can look at these numbers, and I will emphasize that these are millions of dollars. So on average, we're talking anywhere from about $35 to $100+ million in R&D development to get one drug approved. So that doesn't even talk about the money that's being spent on areas that don't make it. So we have a lot of drugs. We have to find a way to prioritize them. It's incredibly costly to do this. So this creates challenge in a resource-constrained environment for all of us. So I think that addresses a couple of things in terms of why we need to think about this differently. If we look at the success stories in the last decade of drugs that actually made it and were approved for oncology, again, I think folks in this room see this in our day-to-day life, but we've definitely seen a change from traditional agents, cytotoxics or non-targeted agents, to biologic pathway-driven medications. And in the past 2 years, I would say about 75–80% of these drugs that have been approved have all been targeted agents. So this gets at trying to figure out how do we make these targeted agents work better. We are thinking we're at an age where we're not going to be able to eke out these incremental changes or small improvements in incredibly large trials for any longer. So we have to figure out, how do we see bigger benefits, how do we design these trials, and how do we get them done? So that brings up sort of the story of looking at these subsets. Most of us were here 2 years ago when we saw this story, and I just put this up here as an example. I myself am a GU oncologist, so I'm not a lung cancer oncologist, but I think most of us were in the crowd when we saw this data presented looking at Crizotinib and the ALK-1 fusion subset of non-small cell lung cancer patients. We never saw these kind of responses with chemotherapy, and this is incredible. We've seen 50–70% responses in patients with a non-chemotherapy agent. So this was incredibly encouraging, and this led to the FDA approval of Crizotinib 2 months after this meeting in 2011. But if we look at where do we go with these types of agents and what's next, well, these were the trials that were then proposed as sort of next steps for Crizotinib. And they were looking at trying to take it head-to-head against chemotherapy. Very relevant questions, and I think these are important for our patients, and these are the trials that we kind of need. But I want to focus in on the sample sizes here to do these, what we consider small phase 3 trials in an era where we often are looking at 1,000+ patient trials. They're trying to accrue 300 to 400 patients. But again, keep in mind, this is only in ALK-1 non-small cell lung cancer patients. So if we look at these numbers, just back of the napkin math, which I think we all do, the phase 1/2 trial for Crizotinib accrued 119 patients. Considering, depending on how you look at it, that roughly represents about 5% of non-small cell lung cancer patients. If you divide that, that means you need to screen almost 2,400 patients to enroll 119 patients. Now, in a phase 1/2 setting, typically people are more anxious. They want to go on trial. Sometimes the eligibility may be loosened a little bit to make sure that the accrual happens. So let's just assume of those 2,400 patients that 90% of them can actually go on the trial. So you still need to screen almost 2,600 patients to do that 119 patient trial. You now start talking about comparing the standards of care chemotherapy, where you need 320 patients, and those numbers go up to 8,000 patients that you need to screen to get 320 patients on a trial. So these numbers are intimidating to look at, but I think the thing that we all take away from this at our individual centers is we can't do this alone. This is not something we can overcome with outreach networks of our individual cancer centers. It's not something even some of the highest volume centers in the country can do alone. And so by necessity, we need to figure out how to work together. How do we do these kinds of trials together? How do we distribute the science, the assays that are involved, the appropriate credit? How do we co-develop with sponsors, putting the science together with the feasibility of the networks to get these done? And this is a new problem in oncology, and I think this is something that nobody has really cracked the nut on this yet and has the textbook about how to do this, but I think this is what we're all facing. Now, if we look at the venues for clinical trials, getting back to some of the points that Pat had talked about, this is looking at some of the clinical trial accruals in Southwest Oncology Group from some of the public data that they put out there, just looking at total numbers. And I'm not want to focus on the numbers, but I want you to look at that bar on the bottom, the red bar. That's really phase 1s and 2s in terms of accruals within the Cooperative group. And this is Southwest Oncology Group, and I can tell you as an ECOG member, these numbers look no different. In fact, they may be even lower at ECOG. So in essence, what we're seeing in the national cooperative groups is we're not seeing phase 1-2 work being done. It's largely phase 3 work. So the ability to do these targeted molecularly driven trials in the phase 1-2 area where you really need a strong go versus no-go decision is not an avenue that the national groups are being able to meet right now in terms of feasibility. So in terms of the current gaps, I think they're just summarized here, which we kind of talked about a little bit. But the NCI cooperative groups are really phase 3 environments. The timelines are not, I think, fast enough for the drug development to meet the needs of sponsors and our patients. There are CTEP phase 2 consortiums, and many of us are members of those consortiums. There are issues there. There are some funding caps in terms of just the way the NCI funding goes in terms of total accruals that can happen there. There are still long timelines in terms of the LOI process, so I think being able to match the agents with the assay and the speed is not met there, and there's still a gap. There are disease-specific consortiums, and I think some of these consortiums have been established and have done a great job in helping drug development in certain diseases, but they are disease-specific. So they lack the infrastructure often to look at multi-disease settings in that early stage. And they do have some issues with speed to accruals in terms of issues of contracting and IRB. There are some of the disease-specific consortiums that I do need to give credit. They've done a great job. But I think there still are some gaps there for certain diseases. So why do we need a consortium? Why are we here? Well, the Big Ten Consortium, as Pat had mentioned, it really was born out of this idea of gaps currently for being able to do these molecularly driven, hypothesis-driven trials in a network fashion, but also this gap for junior investigators in terms of their career and being able to lead these trials, and in essence create a new sort of cadre of molecularly trained physicians who will be able to be in those positions for years to come. This is creating a critical gap both in the clinical environment to do these trials, but also, quite frankly, in the talent to be there in years to come and get the experience in doing these studies. So there's a need for the consortium. Why the Big Ten? So why not, other institutions or other groups? Well, the Big Ten seemed like a natural fit, not just because we are all Big Ten members, but there are some things that actually make sense. So there is research infrastructure that already exists. The Big Ten, a lot of people think about it about athletics, but really the heart of the Big Ten is about the research being done at the institutions, not just in medicine, but across all disciplines. There's large NIH dollars at each of our institutions that can be leveraged to do collaborative work. With the exception of Northwestern, every one of us is a state-funded institution, so I think we understand the opportunities from state funding and also some of the challenges in terms of political environments and how that may affect funding. There are core labs at the institutions, some of which are strong in certain areas, and the ability to bring our strengths together, I think, allows us to do research in a way that we can't do it alone. We're all academic centers, and that goes without saying. The size of the Big Ten, both in terms of the research labs, but also the geography and the patient populations that we can reach and bring into these trials, I think presents a unique opportunity that we can't do at our own centers. And I think the last point is key. We have similar philosophies, visions, goals, and I would actually say sort of culturally, we speak the same language, so to speak. We cover a large geography, but I think we tend to, I think our logistics and our operations, and even just the steering committee calls, we get each other. It's not, in essence, it really is not a new relationship. It's just putting some structure around an already strong existing relationship. So this brings together, we think, a really unique, powerful collaboration. Right now, it involves 11 of the 14 Big Ten institutions. I know that Big Ten and 14, it always seems a little crazy, but it's 11 of the 14 right now that have committed to being in the consortium. And that's not a number that's set in stone. The other ones may come on board, but right now 11 have firmly committed to be in the consortium. One real brief issue about sort of the infrastructure. So the Hoosier Oncology Group was chosen as the clinical trials infrastructure for the Big Ten Consortium. And this has to do with a lot of what the Hoosier Oncology Group has already done for multi-site management. Essentially, we chose not to recreate the wheel, but sort of use the existing infrastructure that's already in place. And I just want to highlight a couple things as it pertains to doing some of these from a sponsor standpoint. So one of the issues is that the Hoosier Oncology Group can do full project management. They are a full-service CRO. They can do everything from the very beginning, IND management, all the way through registration, trials, monitoring, et cetera, everything that's needed from an FDA standpoint. They also are flexible, though, in that if the sponsor doesn't need the full, the full cart menu, we can adjust to those needs. Clean data, I think that's in essence, that's a mandatory. We do all of the monitoring at each of the sites, and we do this routinely, and this would be something that would be part of the Big Ten Consortium. We do this via electronic data capture. One-stop contracting, I think, is one of the key points of this consortium. The way that this was set up is that each of the institutions is essentially sign an institutional participant agreement that handles a lot of the contracting to be in the Big Ten Consortium. That in essence then allows the sponsor to negotiate one contract with the Hoosier Oncology Group that then is gone through the sites. So the HOG handles the sites. For the sponsor, it's one contract with the Hoosier Oncology Group staff in terms of the issues with the trial. So it's not having to negotiate 11 individual contracts. Correlative management, it's one of the points we've talked about in terms of science-driven trials. The Hoosier Oncology Group has been doing this for years. We have experience in terms of putting all of the kits together to do these kinds of correlatives, to send them out, the SOPs, the documentation. So this is something that's not new for us. So being able to do this among the Big Ten Consortium sites, I think, makes sense. And then lastly, drug distribution and management. So the Hoosier Oncology Group traditionally does the drug distribution for these types of trials. So again, from a sponsor standpoint, that can be part of these trials. And then I mentioned the monitoring already. So who are we? Well, this is basically a snapshot of the faces. This is actually the steering committee members of the Big Ten institutions that have signed up. As I mentioned, we have 11 so far that have signed up for this. I'll give you the names kind of here, and I'm not going to go through each one of them individually, but I think what you can see from the list of the names here is that you've got a pretty experienced, heavy hitter, powerful group of people here that have been doing this for a while and understand, I think, sort of the challenges and needs to drug development as we see it today. So the advantages, I think we've talked about. The contracting, I think, is one of the key points. The IND management. One of the issues that comes up is the IRB. The plan for this and the vision is to have a centralized IRB, again, a one-stop shopping for the IRB. I will tell you that that is not in place today, but that actually is going on right now. There is actually reciprocal agreements between 3 of the institutions, and the IRB folks are actually meeting monthly now to hammer this out. We understand that that's going to be the key point in this institution and this type of a consortium, and that's something we're very committed to making happen. So the last 2 slides, I just want to tell you what has happened in the timeline. So as Pat had mentioned, this is only about 2 years, if that, in terms of the actual birth of the idea in 2011. By the fall of 2011, the decision was made to use the Hoosier Oncology Group as the infrastructure for this consortium. In July of 2012, so almost a year ago, 10 of the centers at that time committed to be members. I was chosen as the interim executive officer of the Big Ten Consortium, and the steering committee was appointed. Starting in September of last year, so we're talking fall of last year, so not even after ASCO, even 3 months after, we had our first steering committee meeting. So we're talking about 9 months ago. Then in November of 2012, the IPA, or contracts for the institution, were finalized and circulated to the institutions. By February, that was our first face-to-face meeting of the steering committee and other members. So we're talking 4 months ago is the first face-to-face meeting in this. So this has been moving very quickly. By March, we actually had the first letters of intent from a couple of investigators about trial ideas. Right now, we've got 3 that people are circulating around. And then we're here in June. So this is our kickoff. So we are pretty excited about how fast this has come together. There are still some details, I think, that are in process. But I think we wanted to lay the framework to explain who we are, what we're about, where we want to be, and where we're going. And I think we're all very excited to be a part of this. We're very excited to have everyone here in the room tonight. I think this is something that, I think could transform the way cancer research is done. not just for one drug, but the way we actually approach clinical trials in general. How can you not be excited by that? So, that's